It was late at night in Dillingham Research Facility, a government lab buried beneath an abandoned building on Detroit's outskirts. The lab's very existence was classified, hidden from the public, and even from many within the government. Only a handful of people knew what went on beneath the surface. Dr. Aileen McCarthy, a newly hired quantum physicist, was finishing up her late shift. The lab felt eerily silent. The hum of machinery, the only sound filling the long, narrow corridors. Aileen was young, ambitious, and brilliant, known for her work in subatomic particle research. She had no idea that she was about to stumble upon something that would change her life, and perhaps the future of humanity itself. As she prepared to log off her computer, a strange alert appeared on her monitor. Urgent! Sectors 4 and 5 lockdown imminent. Aileen frowned. Those sectors had been inactive for as long as she'd been there. Before she could process the alert, the lights flickered, and a blaring alarm echoed through the corridors. The facility had never experienced a lockdown drill during her time there, and certainly never one at this hour. She heard hurried footsteps outside and opened her door to see a security officer sprinting past. "What's going on?" she shouted after him. "Return to your station, Dr. McCarthy!" he called back, his face tense with alarm. She felt a chill, but nodded. As she closed her door, her eye caught something unusual on the screen of a nearby workstation. A file labeled Project Aurora. The title meant nothing to her, yet something about it sent a spark of foreboding through her. Unable to resist, she stepped closer and saw the faint glow of the monitor's coordinates flickering under the word Biological Protocols, Activation. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't part of any experiment, she knew. But before she could look closer, her colleague Marco stormed into the room, his face drained of color. "Aileen," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "Whatever you do, don't look at that file." But it was too late. She looked up, eyes wide, as the screen showed two words that changed everything. Human vector. What does this mean?" she stammered, her mind racing to comprehend the term. Marco clenched his jaw. "It means we need to get you out of here now!" Marco's grip tightened on Aileen's arm as he pulled her out of the room, his face tense with urgency. She glanced back at the screen. The words human vector burned into her mind. Every instinct told her to demand answers, but Marco's silent, urgent intensity held her back. The alarms had now quieted, replaced by a stillness that felt more ominous than any sound. They slipped through a maze of corridors, past rows of lab doors with cryptic labels like pathogen studies and microbial containment. But Marco didn't pause. Finally, he pushed open a heavy door leading to a dimly lit stairwell that descended even further underground. Aileen hesitated. "Why are we going down?" she whispered, instinctively lowering her voice. "Just trust me," he muttered, ushering her through. The door thudded shut behind them, sealing them in darkness. They descended quickly, their footsteps echoing off the concrete walls. After several turns, Marco led her into a small room where an old, nearly forgotten lab terminal flickered in the corner. He typed in a series of commands, his fingers shaking as they tapped the keys. After a moment, a window appeared on the screen showing rows of files with ominous names. "Marco," Aileen whispered. "What's going on?" He looked at her, the weight of something enormous behind his eyes. "Project Aurora," he said, finally. "It wasn't what they told us. It's a fail-safe, a last resort." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "Aileen, this project was designed to deploy a biological defense in case of a global crisis, one that would adapt itself to the human body." Aileen stared at him, her mind racing. "What kind of biological defense?" "Something revolutionary," Marco replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "A way to program the human body to resist any threat, biological, viral, even nuclear." He leaned in closer. "But it only works if there's a compatible host to carry and transmit it, and they were never able to find one until now." Aileen's breath caught. Are you saying? Marco's gaze hardened. You're the key, Aileen. Your unique genetics. They fit the activation criteria perfectly. You're the vector. The words hung in the air, each one a revelation she could barely process. All the years she'd spent in quiet dedication, in labs and universities, had somehow led to this moment. But I don't even understand how— You don't have to understand, he interrupted, his voice strained. But you do have to survive. If the protocol fully activates, it'll make you the host of something that could reshape humanity's future. But it's dangerous. If the wrong people find out, they'll take it by force. He stepped back, his face a mix of fear and determination. Aileen, they'll come for you. We have to move now. Aileen's heart pounded as she tried to process Marco's words. The weight of what he'd said, it felt impossible, surreal. She, a human vector for a biological defense that could save humanity. And yet, the terror in Marco's eyes told her he wasn't lying. Before she could speak, the door to the stairwell burst open with a deafening crash. Two men in tactical gear and faceless black helmets stormed in, their weapons aimed squarely at her and Marco. Marco moved instinctively, throwing himself between Aileen and the armed men. "Run, Aileen!" he shouted. For a second, she hesitated. Then instinct took over. She bolted down the narrow hallway, her shoes slapping against the cold concrete as Marco's shouts echoed behind her. She turned a corner, finding herself in yet another hallway lined with rows of heavy metal doors. She tried one, then another, but they were all locked. Panic clawed at her chest. Then she spotted a door labeled Exit Access A14, slightly ajar at the end of the hall. She sprinted toward it, her breaths ragged, every cell in her body screaming at her to survive. Aileen threw herself through the door and found herself in a cavernous chamber, dimly lit by emergency lighting. Ahead of her, she could see a faint outline of another door marked Surface Exit. But as she moved forward, she realized she was not alone. Standing in front of the exit was a tall, silver-haired man in a lab coat, his gaze fixed squarely on her. His eyes, sharp and cold, were filled with something between calculation and amusement. "Aileen McCarthy," he said smoothly, his voice carrying a calm authority. "There's nowhere to run." She stopped in her tracks, her body tensing. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "I am Dr. Elias Rook," he replied with a slight bow. "Director of Project Aurora, and, in some sense, I suppose you could say I am your creator." "My creator?" Aileen's voice quivered, disbelief and fear tangling her words. "Yes, I designed the Aurora Protocol, and for years, we've waited for someone like you, someone whose physiology could sustain the defense program. We've searched all over the world, tested thousands, but none fit the criteria." He smiled, a chilling expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Until you—" Aileen took a step back, but Dr. Rook's gaze never wavered. "Don't be afraid, Aileen. You have an extraordinary purpose, one you may not yet understand. With the protocol, you would carry the very blueprint of survival. But that makes you valuable, indispensable, and it's imperative that you cooperate." "Cooperate?" Her voice grew stronger, anger and fear clashing inside her. "You're talking about using me like a weapon." Dr. Rook's smile faded, replaced with a steely resolve. "I'm not asking, Aileen. This isn't a choice." He gestured toward her, and she felt a sudden surge of cold realization. Behind him, two more guards emerged, blocking her only exit. Aileen's mind raced. She could feel the walls closing in, the reality of her situation crashing down on her. She was no longer a scientist in a lab, she was the experiment. Aileen's pulse thundered as she realized the full extent of her predicament. Trapped, alone, and facing Dr. Rook, she knew her options were disappearing fast. The guards moved in, flanking her as Rook took a step forward. "Your cooperation will ensure the safety of countless lives, Aileen," Rook said, his tone steady, almost paternal. Imagine what we could accomplish together. Humanity could evolve beyond disease, beyond war. You would be the world's safeguard, its first line of defense. Do you even hear yourself? She shot back, her voice rising with defiance. You're talking about making me some kind of tool, stripping me of my life, my choices. This isn't about saving anyone, it's about control. Rook's expression darkened. He gestured to one of the guards, who immediately reached for her arm. Aileen wrenched free, her adrenaline spiking as she searched for any escape route. But they had her cornered. She had only moments before they would force her to comply, or worse. Aileen, please, Rook said, his voice hardening. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. But then, an unexpected distraction. A loud crash echoed from the hallway. Everyone froze, and in that split second, a familiar voice shouted through the chaos. Get down, Aileen! Marco's voice reverberated through the chamber, followed by the rapid crack of gunfire. He appeared in the doorway, his face grim with determination. He fired at the guards flanking her, forcing them to dive for cover. In the chaos, Aileen dropped to the floor and scrambled behind a lab console. Marco! She cried, relief flooding through her. Stay low, he commanded, emptying his last rounds before dashing to her side. He grabbed her hand, pulling her up as they darted toward an emergency exit hidden behind one of the consoles. Rook's shouts filled the room, his anger unmistakable. Stop them! Don't let her get away! As Marco and Aileen pushed through the door, they found themselves in a narrow maintenance corridor. Marco slammed the door behind them, jamming a wrench through the handle to buy them a few extra seconds. They sprinted through the maze of corridors, alarms blaring louder with every step. As they rounded a corner, Aileen finally pulled Marco to a halt, catching her breath. Why did you come back for me? Marco hesitated, a flicker of something intense passing over his face. Because I couldn't just let them take you. You don't know what they're capable of, Aileen. Project Aurora isn't just some defensive protocol. It's designed to give absolute power to whoever controls it. They'll stop at nothing to keep you here. She shook her head, her thoughts spinning. But if I'm really the key to this, why didn't you warn me before? Because I didn't know, he said, voice low and urgent. Until today, I thought you were just another scientist here. But once I saw the Aurora files, I realized they've been planning this for years. They found out about your compatibility months ago, and everything has been leading to this moment. Aileen's mind reeled. They had to get out. But questions clawed at her, each one weighing her down like iron. But Marco, if they're right, if I am the only one who can carry this protocol, won't they just keep coming? Marco's face was grim. That's why we need to disappear. And fast. He looked down the long corridor stretching before them. There's a private hangar a few levels up. If we can make it there, we might have a chance. Aileen took a steadying breath, pushing down her fear. Lead the way. Marco and Aileen raced through the twisting corridors, navigating the hidden passages of the sprawling facility. As they ran, the alarms grew fainter, replaced by the sound of their labored breaths and the dull hum of machinery far below. They reached a stairwell that spiraled up toward the private hangar Marco had mentioned. Aileen glanced back down the dim stairwell, half expecting Dr. Rook's guards to appear any second. How much farther? She whispered, clutching the rail as they hurried upward. Just one more floor, Marco replied. Once we're up there, there's a small plane. I have a friend who can get us out, someone who's not on the government's radar. They reached the top of the stairs, emerging into the concrete, hangar-lit hallway. Marco led her past a series of doors until they reached one marked Maintenance Only. He swiped a badge across the lock, and the door clicked open to reveal a dimly lit storage room stacked with crates and spare aircraft parts. There, he said, pointing toward a small utility door at the other end. That'll take us straight to the hangar floor. They pushed through, stepping out onto the vast, open space of the hangar. Above them, High beams illuminated a single, sleek aircraft parked on the runway, its nose pointed toward a large, reinforced door. Marco pulled her along, his eyes scanning for any sign of movement. But just as they neared the plane, a figure stepped out from the shadows beside it. Aileen's heart sank. Dr. Rook. "Well done, Marco," Rook said, his tone dripping with mock admiration. "You got farther than I expected." He took a step toward them, his gaze locking on Aileen with an unsettling intensity. "Aileen, you need to understand. You can't escape this. Project Aurora isn't something you can run from. It's inside you now, in every cell of your body. The moment you leave here, you become a threat to the very people you hope to protect." Aileen's fists clenched. "You didn't give me a choice. You lied to me, to everyone. You created this thing and hid the truth from us." "Because the truth would have frightened you," Rook replied, his voice steady and unyielding. "Imagine the panic if the world knew we had the power to control and destroy every pathogen on the planet. You, Aileen, are the only person who can carry this power safely, without adverse effects. You were chosen." Aileen glanced at Marco, who gave her a slight nod, a silent signal to stay ready. "Chosen?" she spat, glaring at Rook. "That's just another word for trapped, isn't it?" Rook's expression turned cold. "This isn't a negotiation, Aileen. You have one chance to come willingly." He signaled to the shadows, and several guards moved in from all sides, each armed and watching her intently. Marco tightened his grip on her arm. "We're getting out of here, Aileen. Don't listen to him." In a flash, Marco pulled a small device from his pocket, pressing a button that triggered an explosion on the far side of the hangar. The blast rattled the walls, and thick smoke billowed out, creating a temporary shield between them and Rook's men. "Run!" Marco shouted, tugging her toward the plane. They scrambled up the steps, Marco racing to the cockpit as Aileen buckled herself into the co-pilot's seat, her hands shaking. Through the smoke, she could just make out Rook's silhouette, standing resolute in the haze, his eyes following her with a chilling, calculating calm. Marco flipped a series of switches, and the engine roared to life. "Hold on, Aileen," he muttered. "This might get rough." As the plane lurched forward, Aileen gripped the armrests, her heart hammering. The reinforced doors at the end of the runway began to close, Rook's last attempt to trap them. Marco gunned the throttle, pushing the aircraft to its limit as they hurtled toward the narrowing gap. They shot through just as the doors clanged shut behind them, the sound reverberating through the plane's hull. Outside, the night sky stretched before them, vast and open. As they left the facility and everything Aileen had known behind, the aircraft soared into the night, leaving the research facility and Dr. Rook far behind. As they climbed higher, Aileen allowed herself a single, shaky breath of relief. But her mind was anything but calm. The gravity of what Rook had told her weighed heavily, and she could still feel his gaze, cold and unyielding, seared into her memory. Marco glanced over, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "We'll have to keep a low profile," he said, breaking the silence. "If Rook and his people track us down, they won't hesitate. They'll do whatever it takes to bring you back." Aileen nodded, gripping the armrest as she fought the fear building within her. "But how long can we really run, Marco? Rook was right about one thing. If this protocol is inside me, I can't escape it. I'm a walking target." Marco tightened his jaw, clearly grappling with the same thoughts. "I know. But there's one last card we can play." He took a deep breath. "There's a group, an underground network, scientists and activists who've defected from labs like ours. They call themselves the Watchtower. If anyone can help us, it's them." "The Watchtower?" Aileen repeated, her voice barely audible. She had heard whispers about them, rogue scientists who had banded together to protect humanity from its own technological dangers, but she'd thought they were just a myth. "They're real," Marco confirmed. "And if we can get to them, they might be able to remove the protocol from your system." Maybe even find a way to protect you from Rook. Aileen's heart raced. Could the watchtower be her last hope? Could they truly free her from the weapon that now pulsed within her veins? Their plane skimmed above a stretch of dark mountains as Marco adjusted their course. We'll reach their safe house by dawn, but once we make contact, you'll have to trust them completely. They'll know things Rook never intended you to find out. She took a steadying breath, fear and hope intertwining as she looked out over the vast, shadowed landscape. Then we don't have a choice, do we? She whispered. If there's even a chance they can help, we have to try. But before Marco could respond, a red light flashed on the control panel. His eyes widened. We've been tagged. Aileen's blood ran cold as a radar ping showed up on the screen. Another aircraft was closing in fast. It's them, Marco muttered, flipping switches as he tried to lose their tail. The pursuing aircraft was relentless, gaining on them with chilling precision. Aileen's mind raced. She couldn't let them take her. Not now. Not when they were so close. Desperately, she searched the cockpit and spotted a compartment labeled Emergency Protocol. "Marco!" she shouted, yanking it open. Inside was a small transponder marked with a red button labeled Omega Signal. Marco's face twisted in surprise. The Omega Signal? It's a distress beacon. The watchtower will recognize it. But once we press it, we'll have no choice but to abandon the plane. It's our only chance. Aileen's fingers hovered over the button. She closed her eyes, steeling herself, and pressed it. A shrill alarm filled the cockpit, and within moments, the plane's systems began to power down. Marco grabbed her arm, guiding her toward the emergency hatch as the aircraft spiraled down. "Brace yourself!" he shouted as the wind roared around them. They jumped, plummeting into the night, the cold air biting as they descended toward the mountains below. Moments later, the plane exploded, a brilliant burst of light illuminating the sky as their pursuers veered off course. As they drifted downward, parachutes deploying, Aileen caught a glimpse of distant lights, tiny beacons in the wilderness. The watchtower. When they finally touched down on the rocky terrain, a group of figures approached, their faces obscured by shadows. One stepped forward, their voice steady and familiar. "Dr. McCarthy," the figure said, "we've been waiting for you." In that moment, Aileen realized that she hadn't just stumbled into a secret. She had become the key to humanity's future. With the watchtower's help, maybe she could finally harness the power within her, not as a weapon, but as a force for change.